The shattered vows. James Alcott had always lived in a world of wealth and power. His life was an orchestrated symphony of polished etiquette and high expectations. From his childhood, every step he took was carefully curated by his father, Richard Alcott, a titan of industry, and his mother, Victoria, a socialite known for her unyielding dominance. The Alcott name wasn't just a legacy, it was a kingdom, and James was its crown prince. But James's life, as perfect as it seemed, had a glaring imperfection: his marriage to Sarah. She wasn't the partner his parents had envisioned for their only son. Sarah was kind-hearted, intelligent, and down-to-earth, a schoolteacher who had grown up far from the glittering circles of the elite. James had fallen for her warmth and authenticity, something his world lacked. Despite his parents' objections, he married her. In the beginning, their love was a haven from the pressures of the Alcott dynasty. James felt free with Sarah in a way he never had before. Yet the cracks began to show when their attempts to start a family failed. Months turned into years, and each failed pregnancy brought new levels of tension into their home. Victoria, ever the tactician, didn't hide her disapproval. "An Alcott must produce an heir," she often said, her tone sharp as the diamonds adorning her fingers. "The family legacy demands it." James felt torn between his wife's quiet anguish and his mother's relentless expectations. Sarah endured the whispers at social events, the pitying glances from James's business partners' wives, and Victoria's not-so-subtle barbs. Her strength amazed James, but deep down, he began to question their future. Could he continue to defy his family's demands without losing himself? One night, after a particularly heated argument with his mother, James confronted Sarah. The conversation started with tenderness, but soon spiraled into bitterness. "Sarah," James began, his voice strained, "I don't know how much longer I can do this. My parents, my whole family, they see this as a failure. And you think I don't feel that?" Sarah interrupted, her voice breaking. "You think I don't wake up every day wishing I could give you a child? I've tried, James. I've tried everything." James looked away, guilt and frustration warring in his chest. He hated the situation but couldn't deny the doubts creeping into his mind. In a moment of weakness, he uttered the words that would haunt him for years. "Maybe this wasn't meant to be." Sarah froze, her eyes filling with tears. "What are you saying, James? That you regret us?" James didn't answer. His silence spoke louder than any words could. The departure. The decision to end their marriage came swiftly, though it felt like a slow death to Sarah. James didn't fight for her. Instead, he allowed the weight of his family's expectations to tip the scales. Sarah packed her belongings and left the Alcott estate without looking back, her heart shattered. James watched her go, telling himself it was for the best. He convinced himself that Sarah would be better off without the suffocating burden of his family. But as the days turned into weeks, the silence of the grand estate grew deafening. James buried himself in work, trying to drown the ache of her absence. Victoria wasted no time in arranging potential matches for James. "You need someone who understands the Alcott legacy," she said. "Someone who can fulfill her role as a proper wife." James attended the dinners, met the women, and smiled through the introductions. Yet none of them filled the void Sarah had left. He began to realize that he hadn't just lost his wife. He'd lost the only person who truly saw him beyond the Alcott name. A new beginning for Sarah. Far from the cold grandeur of the Alcott estate, Sarah began to rebuild her life. She moved to a small coastal town, taking a teaching job at a local school. The work was modest but fulfilling, and the community embraced her with open arms. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of freedom. But Sarah carried a secret that even she couldn't fully comprehend. 6 months after leaving James, she discovered she was pregnant. The news came as a shock, filling her with both hope and fear. She had been told by doctors that motherhood might never be possible, yet here she was, carrying not one but 2 lives within her. The twins, when they arrived, were identical boys with dark hair and striking blue eyes. the very image of James. Sarah named them Ethan and Noah, and from the moment she held them in her arms, she vowed to give them a life filled with love and security. She didn't tell James. He had made his choice, and she saw no reason to reopen old wounds. The heirloom. Back at the Alcott estate, life moved on for James, though he felt like he was merely going through the motions. He continued to expand the family empire, earning accolades and admiration from peers. Yet his success felt hollow. One day, while clearing out old belongings in his study, James stumbled upon a keepsake box Sarah had left behind. Inside, he found a photograph of them on their wedding day. She was laughing, her eyes sparkling with joy, a stark contrast to the hollow gaze that haunted his dreams. James's heart ached with regret. For the first time, he began to question the choices that had led him to this point. What was the legacy he had sacrificed so much for? Was it worth the cost of losing the one person who truly mattered? A chance encounter. 7 years later, fate intervened. James was in a small town for a business meeting when he decided to take a walk through the park. He stopped in his tracks when he saw a woman with 2 boys, their laughter ringing out as they played. His breath caught in his throat as recognition dawned. It was Sarah. The boys turned toward him, and James felt as though he were looking into a mirror of his younger self. Their features, so unmistakably his, left him rooted to the spot. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. The world around him seemed to blur as he grappled with the truth standing before him. 7 years had passed, and everything he thought he knew was about to be upended. The unveiling. James stood frozen in the park, his breath caught in his chest. Sarah was here, alive and radiant, with 2 young boys who were unmistakably his. Their dark hair and piercing blue eyes mirrored his own, a fact that sent a wave of confusion and guilt surging through him. How had he not known? How had he let this life slip through his fingers? His heart raced as Sarah turned and locked eyes with him. Her expression shifted from serene joy to a mask of shock and guarded resolve. It was clear she hadn't expected to see him, least of all in the small town she now called home. "James," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions behind it. Her body was tense, protective, as though she were shielding the boys from an unseen danger. "Sarah," James replied, his voice faltering. He didn't know what to say, how to bridge the vast chasm that had grown between them. His eyes flicked to the boys, who were staring at him curiously, their laughter now replaced with silence. The older of the 2, Ethan, tilted his head and asked innocently, "Mom, who's that man?" Sarah took a deep breath, her gaze never leaving James. "Just someone from a long time ago," she said softly, her tone dismissive, but her grip on the boy's shoulders tightening. James felt a pang in his chest at her words. Just someone. That was all he had become in her life. But he couldn't walk away, not now. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low, almost pleading. Sarah hesitated. She glanced at the boys, then back at James. "Ethan, Noah, why don't you go play by the swings for a bit? Stay where I can see you." The boys obeyed, though their curious glances lingered on James as they ran off. Sarah crossed her arms and faced him, her expression hardening. "What are you doing here, James?" she demanded, her voice sharp but controlled. "How did you even find us?" "I didn't," James admitted, running a hand through his hair. "I'm here on business. I had no idea you were in this town, and I didn't know about them." He gestured toward the boys, his voice thick with emotion. "Why didn't you tell me?" Sarah's eyes flashed with anger. "You don't get to ask that," she snapped. "You made your choice, James. You left. You made it very clear that your family's legacy was more important than us." James opened his mouth to argue, but no words came. She was right. He had left her, and in doing so, he had abandoned the possibility of the life they could have shared. "I made a mistake," he said finally, his voice trembling. "I know I can't take back what I did, but I want to make it right. Please, Sarah, I just need a chance to know them." Sarah's jaw tightened, and for a moment, James thought she might refuse him outright. But then she sighed, the fight draining from her shoulders. "They're my whole world, James," she said quietly. "I won't let anyone, especially you, hurt them. If you want to be in their lives, you'll have to prove you're not the man you were 7 years ago." The boys' questions. That evening, as Sarah tucked the boys into bed, Ethan's curiosity got the better of him. "Mom," he said, his small face serious, "who was that man at the park? Why did he look like us?" Sarah hesitated, her heart aching at the question. She had always known this day would come but hadn't expected it to arrive so soon. "That man, he's someone I used to know," she said carefully. "Someone very important to me a long time ago." "Is he our dad?" Noah asked, his voice soft but direct. The question hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. She looked at her sons, their wide, trusting eyes watching her intently. How could she explain everything to them without shattering their world? "Yes," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's your father." The boys stared at her in silence, their young minds processing the revelation. Finally, Ethan spoke. "Why wasn't he here before?" Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "It's complicated," she said, brushing a hand through Ethan's dark hair. "But he's here now. And if you want to get to know him, we'll figure out a way to do that together." James's determination. Back at his hotel, James couldn't sleep. His mind replayed the events of the day, the look in Sarah's eyes, and the boys' curious faces. He couldn't walk away, not this time. He had already lost too much. The next morning, he found himself outside Sarah's small house, a bouquet of flowers in hand. He hesitated before knocking, unsure if he was ready for the confrontation that awaited him. Sarah answered the door, her expression wary but calm. "What are you doing here, James?" "I came to talk," he said, "and to apologize. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want to try." For the boys. Sarah sighed and stepped aside, allowing him to enter. The house was modest but warm, filled with the kind of love and life that had been missing from the Alcott estate. James couldn't help but notice the small touches that spoke of Sarah's efforts to build a happy home. Family photos, children's drawings pinned to the fridge, and the faint smell of cookies baking in the oven. The boys peeked out from the living room, their eyes wide as they spotted James. He crouched down to their level, trying to seem approachable. "Hi," he said, his voice gentle. "I'm James. I'm your dad." Ethan frowned, crossing his arms. "Why weren't you here before?" James swallowed hard, the boy's words cutting deep. "I made a mistake," he admitted. "A big one. But I'm here now, and I want to be part of your lives if you'll let me." Noah stepped closer, studying James with the same intensity Sarah had once had. "Do you like soccer?" he asked. James smiled, relieved at the question. "I do. In fact, I used to play a lot when I was your age." Noah nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe you can play with us sometime." James's heart swelled at the small opening. "I'd like that very much." Bridging the gap. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of cautious steps and tentative connections. James visited often, taking the boys to the park and helping them with their homework. He listened to their stories, laughed at their jokes, and marveled at their unique personalities. Ethan was bold and adventurous, always the first to try something new. Noah, quieter but deeply observant, had a way of seeing straight into people's hearts. Together, they reminded James of everything he had lost, and everything he still had a chance to gain. Sarah watched from a distance, her emotions in turmoil. She saw the way James tried, the way he poured his heart into building a relationship with the boys. But she couldn't forget the pain he had caused or the years she had spent rebuilding her life without him. One evening, as the boys slept, James and Sarah sat together on the porch. The air was thick with unspoken words. "Thank you," James said finally, breaking the silence, "for letting me back into their lives. I know I don't deserve it." Sarah looked at him, her gaze softening slightly. They deserve to know their father, she said simply. But this isn't just about them, James. You hurt me too, and I need to know that you're not going to disappear again. James nodded, his jaw tightening. I won't, he promised. I'm not the man I was, Sarah. I've spent 7 years trying to figure out who I am without my family's expectations hanging over me. And I know one thing for sure. I want to be here. For them. For you. Sarah didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked out at the stars, her mind a whirlwind of memories and emotions. Could she trust him again? Could she let him back into the life she had fought so hard to create? For now, she decided, she would take it one day at a time. The test of redemption. James Alcott had spent weeks attempting to prove himself, not just to Sarah, but to Ethan and Noah. Each visit to their small but warm home brought him closer to the life he'd walked away from, a life he never realized he craved until it was too late. Yet despite his growing bond with the boys, Sarah remained cautious, her heart guarded by years of pain. One Saturday morning, James arrived at the house holding a carefully wrapped gift. He had spent days picking it out, a handcrafted chess set. He remembered Sarah mentioning how much she loved the game, a pastime she hoped to share with her children someday. When Sarah opened the door, she raised an eyebrow at the box in his hands. "What's this?" she asked, her tone neutral. James offered a small, hopeful smile. "A gift. I thought the boys might like it." Before Sarah could respond, Ethan peeked out from behind her. "What is it?" he asked eagerly. James crouched down and held the box out to him. "It's a chess set. Have you ever played?" Ethan shook his head, his curiosity piqued. Noah joined him, looking just as intrigued but hanging back slightly, his natural shyness keeping him rooted to his spot. "It's a game about strategy," James explained, his tone warm. "It's like solving a puzzle with a friend." Ethan grinned. "Can we play now?" Sarah watched the interaction silently. She didn't stop them, but she didn't join in either. Instead, she retreated to the kitchen, leaving James and the boys to set up the game in the living room. Building trust. Over the next hour, the boys listened intently as James taught them the basics of chess. Ethan was quick to pick up on the game, his bold personality reflected in his aggressive moves. Noah, on the other hand, was more cautious, studying the board before making each decision. As James played with them, he felt a flicker of hope. The boys were warming up to him, and he could see glimpses of his younger self in both of them. Ethan's adventurous spirit reminded him of the boy he had been before the weight of the Alcott legacy settled on his shoulders. Noah's quiet intelligence mirrored his own introspective nature. Sarah observed them from the kitchen, her heart conflicted. She couldn't deny the joy in her sons' faces or the genuine effort James was making. But she also couldn't shake the memory of the man who had abandoned her, the man who had prioritized his family's legacy over their love. Later that evening, as James prepared to leave, he lingered at the door. "Thank you for letting me spend time with them," he said, his voice earnest. Sarah crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "You're doing this for them, not for me." James nodded, understanding the layers behind her words. "I know, but I hope that someday I can make things right with you too." Sarah didn't respond, but her silence wasn't as cold as it had been before. Eleanor's interference, while James was trying to rebuild his relationship with Sarah and the boys, his mother, Eleanor Alcott, was growing restless. From her sprawling estate, she watched James's every move through her network of contacts. She knew about Sarah, the boys, and James's attempts to reconnect with them. Eleanor considered the twins a potential asset to the Alcott legacy. They were heirs, after all, carrying the family's unmistakable features. But she viewed Sarah as a liability, a woman who had walked away from the family and its traditions. Eleanor decided to take matters into her own hands. She summoned James to the estate under the pretense of discussing business. When he arrived, she wasted no time getting to the point. "I've heard about your activities," Eleanor said, her tone clipped as she sipped her tea. This woman and her children, what are your intentions? James set his jaw, bracing himself for the confrontation. They're my family, Mother. I'm trying to be a part of their lives. Eleanor scoffed. Those children may carry the Alcott name, but Sarah has no place in this family. She never did. You're wasting your time playing house with her. James's hands clenched into fists at his sides. You don't get to decide that. I've made mistakes, but I'm not going to let you control this. Not anymore. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. You think you can defy me? After everything I've done for you, for this family. James met her gaze, his voice firm. What you've done is ruin everything good in my life. I won't let you do it again. For the first time, Eleanor faltered, taken aback by his defiance. But as James walked out of the room, her expression hardened. She wasn't finished yet. A test of character. James's next visit to Sarah's house was met with unexpected tension. Sarah opened the door, her face pale and her eyes stormy. What's wrong? James asked, his chest tightening with worry. Sarah held up a letter, her hands trembling. This arrived today. From your mother. James took the letter and read it, his anger mounting with each word. Eleanor had written to Sarah, threatening to take legal action for custody of the boys if Sarah didn't allow them to be raised as part of the Alcott family. The letter was cold, calculated, and dripping with condescension. I had no idea she was going to do this, James said, his voice filled with frustration. I'll handle it. Sarah crossed her arms, her eyes blazing. You should have handled her years ago, James. This is exactly why I didn't want you back in our lives. I won't let her use my sons as pawns in her game. James felt the weight of her words and the truth behind them. He had failed to protect Sarah from his family before, and now he was failing her again. I'll fix this, he promised. I won't let her hurt you or the boys. Sarah shook her head, her voice heavy with emotion. You've said that before, James. You'll have to prove it this time. Confronting the past, James returned to the Alcott estate, his determination burning brighter than ever. He found Eleanor in her study, her face serene as she reviewed documents. You went too far, James said, his voice cold. That letter to Sarah. What were you thinking? Eleanor didn't look up. I was thinking about the future of this family. Those boys belong here with us. Sarah is holding them back. James slammed his hand on the desk, causing Eleanor to finally meet his gaze. Those boys are my sons, and I'll decide what's best for them. Not you. Eleanor arched an eyebrow. And what do you think is best, James? A life in some tiny house with their mother. A life without opportunity or privilege. A life with love. James shot back. Something you wouldn't understand. Eleanor's lips tightened. You're making a mistake, one you'll regret. No, James said, his voice steady. The only mistake I made was letting you control my life for so long. That ends now. A turning point. James's confrontation with Eleanor marked a turning point in his journey. He returned to Sarah's house, weary but resolute. I told her to back off, he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. I'm cutting ties with her if that's what it takes to protect you and the boys. Sarah studied him, searching for signs of sincerity. For the first time, she saw a man who was willing to fight for something more than his family's legacy. A man who might be capable of change. It's not going to be easy, she said softly. James nodded. I don't care how hard it is. I just want to do what's right. For the first time in years, Sarah felt a flicker of hope, not just for James, but for the family they might still become. A fragile trust. James Alcott had always believed in power and control, principles instilled in him by his mother, Eleanor. But as he stood in Sarah's small kitchen, watching her pour coffee into two mismatched mugs, he realized that true power came from earning trust, not demanding it. And trust, he knew, was a fragile thing. The boys, Ethan and Noah, were still asleep upstairs, their soft snores barely audible over the hum of the coffee maker. The previous night had been a small breakthrough. For the first time, they had asked James to read them a bedtime story. Sitting on the worn carpet of their room, he had stumbled through the fantastical tale, their giggles lightening his heart with every silly voice he attempted. It was a small victory, but one he clung to tightly. "Thanks for standing up to your mother," Sarah said, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, but James could sense the tension beneath it. "I wasn't sure you had it in you." James took the mug she offered, the steam curling between them like a tenuous connection. "I should have done it years ago," he admitted. "I let her control too much of my life. But I'm not letting her hurt you or the boys." Sarah leaned against the counter, her gaze sharp. "It's not just about standing up to her, James. It's about proving you're not going to run again when things get hard." James nodded, the weight of her words settling on his shoulders. "I won't," he promised. "I'm here to stay." Sarah didn't respond, but the flicker of doubt in her eyes spoke volumes. Eleanor's counterattack. Back at the Alcott estate, Eleanor seethed. For the first time in her life, she felt powerless. James's defiance was an affront she hadn't anticipated. She paced her study, her sharp heels clicking against the polished wood floors, her mind racing with plans to regain control. She called her attorney, a man who had been on the Alcott payroll for decades. "We need to act quickly," she instructed, her voice icy. "Find a way to bring the boys under the family's guardianship. Use their education, their future, whatever angle you can." The attorney hesitated. "Mrs. Alcott, this could backfire. If James is aligned with Sarah, we risk alienating him completely." Eleanor's lips thinned into a hard line. "James will come to his senses. He always does." But as the line disconnected, a sliver of uncertainty crept into her mind. For the first time, she wasn't entirely sure she could bend her son to her will. A new challenge. James's commitment to rebuilding his relationship with Sarah, and the boys faced its first real test when Ethan came home from school one day with a flyer in hand. It was an announcement for the annual father-son camping trip hosted by the local school. "Can we go?" Ethan asked eagerly, his eyes lighting up with excitement. "All my friends are going with their dads." James hesitated, glancing at Sarah. He could see the doubt flicker across her face. This wasn't just a camping trip. It was a test. A chance to prove himself not just to Ethan and Noah, but to Sarah as well. "Of course," James said, forcing confidence into his voice. "I'd love to go." Noah, quieter but just as hopeful, looked at Sarah for reassurance. She smiled softly. "If you boys want to go, then go. Just be safe." The boys cheered, their excitement contagious. But as they ran upstairs to pack, Sarah pulled James aside. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. "It's not just a camping trip to them. It's a chance to see if you'll show up, if you'll follow through." "I know," James said, his tone serious. "And I won't let them down." Into the wild. The campground was bustling with activity when James and the boys arrived. Tents dotted the grassy field, and the air was filled with the scent of wood smoke and the sounds of children laughing. Ethan and Noah ran ahead, their energy boundless as they explored their new surroundings. James set up their tent, his movements clumsy but determined. He wasn't an outdoorsman by any stretch of the imagination, but he was willing to learn for the sake of his sons. As the day wore on, they hiked through the woods, roasted marshmallows over the fire, and told stories under the stars. For James, the trip was more than just an adventure. It was a revelation. He saw pieces of himself in his sons, not just in their features but in their personalities. Ethan's boldness, Noah's quiet introspection. They were mirrors reflecting both his strengths and his flaws. That night, as the boys drifted off to sleep in the tent, James sat outside, staring at the fire. The weight of his past choices pressed heavily on him. He thought of all the moments he had missed, all the milestones he hadn't been there for. But he also felt a glimmer of hope. He couldn't change the past, but he could fight for the future. The storm. On the second night, the weather took an unexpected turn. Dark clouds rolled in, and a sudden storm lashed the campground with rain and wind. James woke to the sound of thunder, the tent shaking under the onslaught. "Dad." Noah's voice was small and scared in the darkness. "I'm here," James said, crawling over to his sons. He pulled them close, shielding them as best he could from the rain that seeped through the tent. When morning came, the campground was a mess. Many families had packed up and left during the night, but James stayed. He helped the boys salvage their belongings, his determination unshaken despite the challenges. Sarah was waiting on the porch when they returned home, her relief evident as she hugged the boys tightly. She glanced at James, her expression unreadable. "You stayed," she said quietly. "I told you I wouldn't let them down," James replied. For the first time, Sarah's gaze softened, and James felt a small crack in the wall she had built around her heart. A fragile piece. The camping trip marked a turning point for James and his sons. Ethan and Noah began to trust him more, seeking him out for advice, and including him in their games. Sarah, though still guarded, allowed herself to hope that James's change was real. But the shadow of Eleanor's interference loomed large. Sarah received another letter, this one more aggressive, threatening legal action to secure the boys' proper upbringing. She showed it to James, her hands trembling. "This has to stop," she said. "I won't let her take my children." James took the letter and tore it in half. "She won't. I'll make sure of it." And for the first time, Sarah believed he might just keep his word. A new beginning. As the weeks turned into months, James continued to prove himself. He attended school events, helped with homework, and spent evenings sharing stories with the boys. He was slowly earning back the trust he had lost, one small act at a time. But the journey was far from over. Eleanor's presence remained a looming threat, and the scars of the past still lingered. Yet, amidst the uncertainty, there was hope, a fragile, beautiful thing that both James and Sarah clung to. They were rebuilding their lives, piece by piece, and for the first time, James felt like he was finally becoming the man he was always meant to be. The reckoning. James Alcott's transformation was still in progress, but the pieces of his life had started to fit together in ways he hadn't thought possible. His bond with Ethan and Noah had strengthened. Their trust, while not fully earned, was growing. He could see it in the way Noah reached for his hand during a scary moment in a movie, or how Ethan proudly showed him a drawing he had made. Each small moment was a step forward. But the tension between James and Eleanor Alcott had reached a boiling point. The latest letter she sent to Sarah was more than just a threat. It was a declaration of war. Eleanor had filed for temporary custody of the boys, claiming James had failed to provide them with the life-befitting Alcott heirs. The court summons arrived on a cold Monday morning, and it hit Sarah like a gut punch. The court summons. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she stared at the official envelope. James had just walked in, carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers he had picked with Ethan and Noah during their morning walk. "What's this?" he asked, his tone light before catching sight of Sarah's pale face. She slid the envelope toward him without a word. James opened it, his eyes scanning the contents. His face darkened as he read the accusations: neglect, an unfit environment, and a call for the boys to be brought under Eleanor's guardianship. "This is her doing," James said, his voice hard. "She's trying to take them from you. From us." Sarah's eyes blazed with anger. "She'll have to fight me first." James reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "I'll fight her," he said, his voice steady. "I'll go to court. I'll testify. I'll do whatever it takes to protect them." Sarah's expression softened, but her distrust lingered. "This isn't just about winning a case, James. It's about proving you're not her puppet anymore." James nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I'll prove it. To you, to the boys, to everyone." Preparing for battle. The days leading up to the court hearing were a whirlwind of meetings with lawyers, gathering documents, and preparing testimony. Sarah worked tirelessly, combing through every detail of her life to demonstrate that the boys were happy, healthy, and thriving. Meanwhile, James confronted the mess his mother had created. Eleanor was unrepentant when he visited her to demand she drop the case. "You're throwing your life away on that woman," she said, her tone as sharp as ever. "Those boys deserve the Alcott legacy." James's temper flared. "They deserve love, Mother. Something you've never understood." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "You're making a mistake." "No," James replied, his voice resolute. "The only mistake I made was letting you control me for so long. That ends now." The courtroom showdown. The day of the hearing arrived. The courtroom was a sterile, intimidating space, its wooden benches filled with spectators who had come to witness the high-profile battle. On one side sat Eleanor, flanked by her team of expensive lawyers. On the other sat Sarah, with James by her side. Ethan and Noah were not present, a choice Sarah had made to protect them from the emotional weight of the proceedings. But their absence only deepened James's resolve. He couldn't let them down. Eleanor's lawyers painted a picture of Sarah as an unfit mother, claiming she lacked the resources and connections to provide for the boys. They argued that the Alcott family could offer opportunities Sarah never could. Elite education, financial stability, and access to powerful networks. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she stood tall, her voice clear and unwavering. "My boys don't need wealth or connections," she said. "They need love, stability, and a parent who puts them first. I've built a life for them, a life filled with laughter, learning, and support. They are thriving, and I won't let anyone take that away." James took the stand next, his testimony a raw and honest account of his failures and regrets. He admitted to abandoning Sarah, to prioritizing his family's legacy over his own happiness. But he also spoke of his transformation, of the love he had rediscovered in his sons and the family he was fighting to rebuild. "My mother sees my sons as heirs," James said, his voice steady. "But I see them as individuals. They are not pawns in a legacy. They are my children, and I will do whatever it takes to protect them." The verdict. The judge deliberated for what felt like an eternity. When he finally returned, the tension in the room was palpable. After reviewing the evidence and hearing the testimony, the judge began, his voice firm. "It is clear that the best interests of the children lie with their mother, Miss Sarah Bennett. Custody will remain with her, and the petition for guardianship is denied." Relief washed over Sarah like a tidal wave. Tears filled her eyes as she grasped James's hand. For the first time, she saw him not as the man who had abandoned her, but as the man who had fought to stand by her side. Eleanor, seated across the room, looked defeated. For the first time in her life, she had lost. But James didn't gloat. He simply turned his back on her and walked out of the courtroom with Sarah. A new chapter. The aftermath of the court case brought a renewed sense of peace to Sarah's home. Eleanor had retreated, her influence finally broken. James continued to work on earning Sarah's trust, showing up for the boys in every way he could. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching Ethan and Noah play in the yard, Sarah turned to James. "You proved me wrong," she said softly. James looked at her, his heart pounding. "Does that mean you trust me?" Sarah smiled faintly. "It means I'm starting to." The proposal. A few weeks later, James took Sarah and the boys to the park where he had first seen them after 7 years apart. As the boys played, James knelt before Sarah, holding a small velvet box in his hand. "Sarah," he began, his voice trembling, "I don't deserve you, but I want to spend the rest of my life making up for my mistakes. Will you marry me?" Sarah stared at him, tears filling her eyes. She thought of all they had been through, the pain, the struggles, the redemption. Slowly, she nodded. "Yes, James," she said, "but this time, it's on our terms." James slipped the ring onto her finger, his heart swelling with joy. For the first time in years, he felt whole. As Ethan and Noah ran over, laughing and asking what had happened, Sarah pulled them close and whispered, "We're a family now. A real one." James hugged them all, the weight of his past finally lifting as he looked toward a brighter future. Building bridges and embracing futures. The sun rose over the small town where Sarah, James, and their boys had begun to weave the threads of a new life together. The trial was behind them, Eleanor's shadow no longer looming over their family, and the air seemed lighter. For James, every sunrise was a reminder of the second chance he had been given. But healing wasn't instantaneous. It was a journey, and their family still had much to navigate. The Alcott legacy revisited. James had made his decision to step away from the Alcott family empire, but Eleanor's words still echoed in his mind. "You're throwing away a legacy." For years, he had believed the legacy defined him, and abandoning it felt like losing a part of himself. But the laughter of Ethan and Noah, the warmth of Sarah's presence, and the simplicity of their new life reminded him that the real legacy was the one he was creating with them. Still, his departure from the Alcott business world wasn't as simple as walking away. James knew the empire his family had built could impact the future of his sons if wielded responsibly. After days of deliberation, he decided to make one last trip to the estate. The final confrontation. James arrived unannounced, stepping into the grand hall of the Alcott estate for what he intended to be the last time. Eleanor was seated in her usual spot in the sunroom, sipping tea and pretending to read a book. She looked up as he entered, her expression cold. "You've come back," she said, her tone unreadable. "Have you finally realized the mistake you're making?" "No," James replied firmly. "I've come to make one thing clear. I'm not abandoning my family or their future, but I refuse to let the Alcott name dictate the terms of their lives." Eleanor set her teacup down with a sharp clink. "The Alcott name is what built you. Without it, you're—" "Without it," James interrupted, his voice calm but resolute, "I'm free. And so are my sons." Eleanor's expression flickered with something close to vulnerability, though she quickly masked it. "You think you're better off without the wealth, the influence. I think my sons are better off with a father who knows how to love them," James replied. "I'm not here to argue, Mother. I'm here to tell you that if you ever try to interfere in our lives again, I will ensure you have no influence over the boys, legally or otherwise." Eleanor's lips tightened, but she said nothing as James turned and walked away. For the first time in his life, he felt the weight of her control lift. Returning to family, James returned home to Sarah and the boys, his resolve stronger than ever. The small house was alive with the sounds of dinner being prepared, laughter echoing from the kitchen. Sarah stood at the stove, stirring a pot, while the boys worked on setting the table. "Hey, you're just in time," Sarah said, glancing at James with a warm smile. "Ethan's been telling Noah all about his new science project. Apparently, it involves vinegar and baking soda everywhere." James chuckled, the sight of his family a balm to his soul. "Sounds messy," he said, ruffling Ethan's hair as he passed. "It's an experiment," Ethan declared, puffing out his chest. "I'm going to show you after dinner." James grinned. "I can't wait." Facing the past together. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah and James worked on rebuilding the trust that had been fractured so long ago. They attended family counseling sessions, something Sarah suggested to help them communicate more openly. While the sessions were challenging, they became a space where James could articulate the guilt he had carried, and where Sarah could express the pain of his absence. "I was angry for a long time," Sarah admitted during one session, her voice trembling. "Not just at you, but at myself, for believing you'd stay." James reached for her hand, his own trembling slightly. "I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. I just want to keep proving that I'll stay this time." A milestone for the boys. The family faced another milestone when Ethan and Noah's school hosted a father-son night. It was a sports-themed event with games, competitions, and a chance for fathers and sons to bond. James had been nervous about attending. He still felt the weight of his past mistakes whenever he looked at his sons, but he couldn't let his fear hold him back. When they arrived, Ethan and Noah immediately dragged James toward the basketball court. They played a chaotic, laughter-filled game. The boys delighted every time James passed them the ball or pretended to stumble clumsily while trying to block their shots. Toward the end of the night, Ethan turned to James, his face serious. "You're not going to leave again, right?" James knelt down to Ethan's level, his heart heavy but steady. "No, buddy," he said. "I'm here for good. I promise." Noah joined them, wrapping his small arms around James's neck. "We're glad you're here," he whispered. James hugged them both tightly, tears welling in his eyes. He had spent years running from his responsibilities, but in that moment he felt the full weight of what it meant to be a father, and he welcomed it. Sarah's hesitant hope. While James's bond with the boys grew stronger, Sarah found herself grappling with her own emotions. She had agreed to marry James, but the wounds of their past couldn't be ignored. One evening, as they sat on the porch after the boys were asleep, she voiced her concerns. "James," she began, her voice hesitant, "I'm scared." He turned to her, his expression soft. "Of what?" "Of trusting you completely," she admitted. "Of letting myself believe that this time is different." James reached for her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "I understand, Sarah, and I don't expect you to believe me overnight. But I'll keep showing up, every day, until you do." Sarah looked at him, her heart conflicted but hopeful. "I want to believe you," she said softly. "For the boys' sake, and for mine." Moving forward, James and Sarah began taking small steps toward blending their lives fully. They talked about their future, discussing what it would mean to share a home, to raise the boys together as a family. James even suggested returning to work in a smaller capacity, building something new for their family rather than relying on the Alcott empire. One weekend, the family took a trip to the beach, a place James had never visited during his years in the city. Watching Ethan and Noah chase the waves, James felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had been given a second chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. As the sun set, Sarah joined him on the sand, the boys' laughter echoing in the distance. James slipped his arm around her, and for the first time in years, Sarah leaned into him fully. "We're going to be okay," she said, her voice steady. James smiled, his heart full. "Yeah," he agreed. "We are." A family reborn. Their journey was far from over. There would be challenges, doubts, and moments of uncertainty. But as they stood together on the beach, the four of them silhouetted against the fading light, they knew they had something worth fighting for. For James, Sarah, Ethan, and Noah, the future was no longer a distant dream. It was here, now, and it was theirs to create, together. A home rebuilt. James and Sarah's journey toward rebuilding their family was not without its challenges, but it was also filled with moments of joy, discovery, and healing. The trust they were rekindling grew stronger with each shared experience, while their love, though tested, began to flourish again, solidifying the bond. One afternoon, as the boys played in the backyard, James and Sarah sat together at the kitchen table, going over plans to renovate the house. It was a modest home, but James saw it as a symbol of their fresh start. "We could add a bigger porch," James suggested, sketching on a notepad. "Maybe a swing for the boys." Sarah laughed softly. "You're really into this, aren't you?" James looked up, his expression earnest. "I want to make this place feel like home for all of us. For you, for the boys, for our family." Sarah's smile faded into something more tender. She reached out, placing her hand over his. "It already feels like home, James, because you're here." Their moment was interrupted by the boys running into the house, their faces flushed with excitement. "Mom, Dad," Ethan exclaimed. Noah found a turtle in the yard. "It's huge," Noah added, holding his arms out wide. James laughed, rising from the table. "Let's go see this massive turtle then." As they followed the boys outside, Sarah watched James, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and hope. He was becoming the man she always knew he could be. A surprise visit. The peace they were building was tested once more when Eleanor arrived unannounced. Her chauffeur-driven car pulled up in front of the house, and James saw her step out, her presence as commanding as ever. James met her at the door before she could knock. "What are you doing here, Mother?" Eleanor's gaze swept over him, then shifted to the house behind him. "I came to see my grandchildren." James's jaw tightened. "You don't get to decide when you're a part of their lives." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "You think cutting ties with the Alcott family means you can erase me? They're my blood." Sarah appeared at the door, her expression calm but resolute. "This isn't about blood, Eleanor. It's about what's best for the boys. And you threatening to take them from me wasn't in their best interest." Eleanor hesitated, her usually confident demeanor faltering. "I made a mistake," she admitted, her voice quieter than before. "I wanted to protect the family legacy, but I see now that I went about it the wrong way." James crossed his arms. "If you're here to apologize, then say it. Otherwise, leave." Eleanor's gaze softened slightly, and she nodded. "I am sorry for what I did and for the pain I caused. I would like to make amends, if you'll allow it." Sarah and James exchanged a glance. It was a moment of reckoning, one that could shape their family's future. Sarah finally spoke. "Eleanor, the boys come first. If you want to be part of their lives, it has to be on our terms." Eleanor nodded again, her expression unreadable. "Understood. A family forged in love." Over the next few months, Eleanor's attempts to reconnect were slow and cautious. She visited occasionally, bringing thoughtful gifts and spending time with the boys. While Sarah remained wary, she allowed Eleanor to build a relationship with her grandchildren, always under careful supervision. Meanwhile, James continued to solidify his place in their lives. He started a small business in town, one that allowed him to remain present for Sarah and the boys. He attended every school event, every soccer game, and every milestone, big or small. One evening, as they sat around the dining table, Ethan asked, "Dad, were you scared when you left your big house?" James paused, considering the question. "I was scared," he admitted, "but I realized that having a big house doesn't make you happy. What makes you happy is being with the people you love." Noah tilted his head thoughtfully. "Like us." James smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "Exactly like you. A wedding and a new beginning." Months later, James and Sarah stood together in a small, intimate ceremony in their backyard. Surrounded by friends, neighbors, and the boys, they exchanged vows that spoke of second chances and enduring love. Ethan and Noah acted as ring bearers, beaming with pride as they watched their parents make their family official. As James slid the ring onto Sarah's finger, he whispered, "I'll never let you down again." Sarah smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "I know." When they kissed, the boys cheered, and their guests applauded. It wasn't a grand affair, but it was perfect because it was theirs. Epilogue. A legacy of love. Years later, the Alcott name carried a new meaning. It wasn't about wealth, power, or influence. It was about family, resilience, and love. James and Sarah raised Ethan and Noah in a home filled with laughter, respect, and support. They taught their sons that true strength came from kindness, and that legacy was about the lives you touched, not the power you wielded. Eleanor, though still a formidable figure, softened in her old age. She became a doting grandmother, often surprising the boys with her sharp wit and surprising warmth. While she would never fully admit it, she had learned from her son's journey. As James watched his sons grow into confident, compassionate young men, he felt a peace he had never known. The family he had once thought he lost was now his greatest joy. And every day, he worked to honor the second chance he had been given. Because in the end, the greatest legacy wasn't the Alcott name, it was the love they shared.